Good afternoon and welcome back to the International PHP Conference. My name is Sarah Schlotthauer and I am an editor at jackcenter.com. The following session is about WordPress for modern developers. And today's host is Samuel Levy from Determined Development. Before I pass it over, just a quick reminder to please use the swap card chat if you need help via our technical staff, or if you just want to comment and talk about the session. Of course, you could also use it to ask some questions, and if there is time after the end of the session, then Samuel will answer all of your questions. And with that, I am pleased to announce Samuel Levy.
Hello, I assume I am on now. Hi, this is a talk about using WordPress for modern developers and making it work like a modern framework. I'll just make sure I have the right access. Okay, first a little bit about me. I've been freelancing for about 9 years, currently running a small web dev consultancy. I've been writing PHP for a long number of years, probably about 15. I like to call myself a code monger. It doesn't mean much other than I write a lot of code, and I do a lot of weird things with code. For example, my main blog is not WordPress. It is a 3,000 line single PHP file, which I wrote because it seemed like a good idea at the time. And it's been chugging along for probably a good 10 or more years now. So let's get into this. Let's talk about WordPress. What do we know about WordPress? WordPress is primarily blog software. A lot of people don't actually realize this. I've had clients come up to me and ask me if I could add a blog to their WordPress site, simply because they weren't aware that it was originally blog software. WordPress is very flexible. There's a lot of stuff that's been that you can add to WordPress very easily, very quickly. There's a huge amount of plugins, there's a huge amount of themes, and it's very forgiving in what it lets you do and get away with. WordPress is a platform. It's a platform for creating all sorts of other sites, e-commerce, booking sites, all sorts of things. You can create it with WordPress. I've even seen full-fledged ERPs built into WordPress for some reason. And WordPress is deeply legacy. The first version of WordPress was written before I was a professional developer. It was probably written, it was written a long time ago. I can't remember if it just hit its 15 or 25 year, 15 years. PHP just hit 25 years. Anyway, it's legacy. It's still got a lot of original code. I'm not going to say it's a great system, but it works, and like all legacy things, people have learned to work with it and work around it. Basically, you can do a lot of things with the WordPress, and it makes you wonder what you can't do with WordPress. Not much. If you want e-commerce, just open source straight out of the box. There's WooCommerce, there's a whole bunch of other plugins, e-learning plugins that just convert your WordPress site into doing all sorts of things. Social networking, there's a whole bunch of plugins that do that. It's incredibly flexible. You can do a lot with WordPress just straight out of the box in a few plugins. Unless you want to start writing your own themes and plugins, then it gets a little bit more hairy. I've used this picture. I'm sure almost everyone here has had the Fractal of Bad Designs blog post that's increasingly out of date and was probably defunct but when it was posted. I'm sure everyone's had that thrown at them at some point or another. And the best result of that was this double-clawed PHP hammer, which kind of was the author's description of what PHP was like, a tool that works if you know how to use it, but compared to all of the other tools you're expecting to find, it's just a bit wrong. And WordPress being legacy PHP kind of exemplifies that. So how do we make WordPress more developer friendly? We want to be able to use a template language, so Blade or Smarty or Twig. We would love to have proper ORM data models so we can use query builders and have nice mapping between objects that we pass around and use. We'd like to have controllers for actually managing certain parts of the page and certain types of pages. It'd be great to see a little bit of a dependency injection so we can pull some bits of the environment in more easily. Request routing, that'd be absolutely fantastic if we knew what we were going to get or where it was going to go predictably. And that brings me to Lumen. Lumen, for those who aren't aware, is the micro framework version of Laravel. It is much more lightweight. It is designed for creating APIs. It doesn't have a lot of the overhead that Laravel has. It doesn't handle user authentication. It doesn't handle sessions. It's very, very small, cut down, lightweight, but it has templates. It has routing. It has database models. It has Eloquent. It has all these bits and pieces that we said we'd kind of like to have in WordPress, but we don't have them. So I decided to see what would happen if we put Lumen as a theme in WordPress. See if we could get it running, see if we could get a full modern framework running inside of WordPress just as a theme. And there are a couple of challenges. The first challenge was getting WordPress to acknowledge Lumen as a theme. Turns out this was super easy, barely an inconvenience. WordPress by default looks for a file called functions.php and a file called style.css anywhere in your theme folder. The lowest level that it finds it, it assumes that is the repository root. So we can add those to the public folder of Lumen. That means WordPress ignores everything outside, all the app and config and all of that type of stuff, and it assumes the public folder is the root of the theme. So it works with that assumption and runs everything from there. And what WordPress does is when it's booting up, it loads the current theme and loads functions.php from that current theme. And then later on, it'll call index.php. So all we need is a style CSS. This doesn't have to have any real CSS data in it. Mostly it has a little bit of metadata so WordPress can recognize that that is the root of the theme and pull a bit of information from it. In functions, we can boot up the Lumen app. So we take a little bit from the original index and move it into functions, and we just boot the app up. And then when we get to index.php, we run Lumen. And this worked surprisingly well, surprisingly easily, and gave me my first Lumen error page running from WordPress. So the problem there is we've got to make Lumen, recognize that it's not the application. WordPress is the application. Lumen is just kind of running inside of WordPress. WordPress itself is expecting to find actual PHP files that relate to template parts, and I'll get into that in a minute. And it's expecting to find all these files, but all we have are index.php and functions.php. WordPress already has a whole bunch of the environment built and running before Lumen gets run. So WordPress already knows what page is being requested, whether the user's logged in, whether the user can see that page, their query, the number of posts, which posts there are, all these things. Lumen already knows all of this stuff straight off the bat. And Lumen doesn't like that the public folder is not actually the web root that's being accessed. If you're unaware, what's happening, where Lumen is sitting is in the web root under WP content, themes, and in this case, WordPress, and then public. So it's expecting public to be the web root, and instead it's several levels deep. So Lumen doesn't like that too much. So let's talk about the WordPress template hierarchy. That's what this thing is. This is how WordPress decides what files to run from a WordPress theme. You come from the left side and you keep moving further and further right until you find a file that actually exists. So for example, we start with the archive page. If it's an author archive, WordPress first looks for author-nice name, which is the user's name. So in my case, it would be Sam. So it would look for author-sam.php. And that would be useful if you had to style one particular user differently to everyone else and you were using just straight templates. If it can't find that, it tries the author ID, so author-2.php or author-1, depending on who the user is. If it can't find that, it falls back to just straight up author.php. Maybe you've defined just a standard template for all authors. Failing that, it'll fall back to archive.php because this is an archive page. And failing all of that, it falls back to index.php. If it can't find anything else, it falls back to index.php. And that's the one thing that we have in Lumen already. It's already there. So you look at this whole thing and you squint a little bit and it all looks a little bit like this. No matter what page is requested, they can all fall back to index.php, which is where Lumen's expecting to run from. So we end up with a workflow that looks like this. We have a GET request for author/Sam. That goes into WordPress. WordPress boots up, it finds the theme, and it runs functions.php. In that file, we boot up Lumen. We also add a bunch of filters into WordPress, so we can watch the attempts of WordPress to get the template hierarchy. So we can watch its attempts to find each of those files, and we can store them for later use. Once we've done that, Lumen hands control back to WordPress. We haven't been actually asked to render anything yet. WordPress runs along, and then it gets to the rendering stage. It's figured out what the request is. It's figured out it's trying to get the page for a particular author, and that author is Sam. So it starts looking in the Lumen public folder and looking for author-sam.php, and it can't find it. It looks for author-2.php because my user is user2, and it can't find it. It looks for author.php, can't find it. Looks for archive.php, can't find it. It can find index.php, so it just includes that. That file runs Lumen. And what we do from Lumen is we've used the filters to capture all of the files WordPress was trying to find, and we can throw them at our routes. So now we have a route here, which is author-name, and name is in Laravel routing, that's a variable that gets passed along to the actual controller. So we can have the author controller get called with the by name method. It calls author controller by name, it passes the name and sends the response back to the user. So when we boot up Lumen in functions.php, we also use this little ugly chunk of code which knows about all the different types of routes that WordPress is going to be looking for, all the different template hierarchies, and it adds filters for all of them. And in that filter, it just basically grabs the template WordPress is looking for and adds it as a possible route that we could use later on. And then when we run Lumen, when we run the application, instead of calling app run like normal, we call app run WordPress routes. And this is another nasty piece of code which creates a request dispatcher and runs through every possible route that WordPress was looking for, every possible template the WordPress was looking for, and attempts to dispatch it as a GET request. And if it can, it marks it as found. And we know which route it was because that route exists. If the dispatcher can't find the route, then we just keep moving on until we find one. And if we can't find it, we fall back to the index route. And once we have found that route, we create a new request, which has just the route that we were after, and we run the application with that request. So if we have a look at the author controller, we can just do a quick die and dump on request and name, and then we can see there is the full request. We can see from the path info that as far as Lumen is concerned, the path requested was author-sam and not author/sam. And we can also see that it was passed the string Sam as the author's name. So that's great. We've got routing working, we've got template acquisition working, and we've got Lumen understanding, or even if it's not understanding that it's not the root of the application, it's behaving like it's not the root of the application. It's running within the WordPress lifecycle. So we get to the next challenge, which is database access. So let's talk about how data is stored in WordPress. Everything is a post. Everything in WordPress is a post. If you have a page, it's a post. Posts are posts. Images are posts. If you're using WooCommerce, products are posts. Orders are posts. Everything's a post. Post meta is used to extend posts. So you're having a look at all the different types of posts and you'll go, but hey, don't WooCommerce products have extra details? They're added as post meta. Don't orders have prices and things like that and amount paid and stuff? It's all post meta. So each object is not one, but two tables, which are spread across, and maybe even more if the plugins decided to add extra tables to track extra stuff. Custom post types are defined largely in code, not as classes, but as an array passed to register custom post types, which has some interesting side effects. Nothing stops you from overriding a post type. And I've run into this several times with clients where they've installed 2 or 3 plugins which all do essentially the same thing. So they might have 2 or 3 booking plugins and they all try to define a booking post type. And that means 2 of the plugins break because their post type doesn't match what's actually being used, whatever was registered first. Also, posts can be versioned. You'll have probably seen this if you've used WordPress. You'll have autosaves. You'll have multiple different versions of a single post. And only one of them is the correct version that should be published and used. But the database might have 100 different other versions saved there. They all have the same ID, and it's up to WordPress to decide which is the right version. And yeah, because of these couple of things, it's fairly difficult to find and use and manage objects. And it gets worse. So Lumen is configured through a .env file to access the database. We don't want to be dumping a .env file somewhere down in the web root. The whole point of .env is it's outside of the web root when you are when you include it as in a standard Lumen or Laravel application. Another problem is WordPress uses the MySQLi library, but Eloquent uses PDO. Both very similar in a lot of ways, but they're not 100% compatible. Another problem is models define access to a table of data, but they don't define the structure of what's in the table. In some ORMs they do, but in Eloquent they don't. They just say, hey, the table's here, grab the fields. The problem is that the fields in WordPress are spread across multiple tables. So one particular object might have a whole bunch of data in a whole bunch of different places. Because that custom post types don't really fit into Eloquent very easily. And by the time you get to Lumen, WordPress has already decided which posts are going to be used and displayed. Yeah, it basically gets really messy and a huge headache. So this is where I came across a project called Corcel. There are others, but Corcel is the one that I found first, and it seemed to do the job very well from what I could see. Corcel is a plugin or a package for Laravel, which provides eloquent access to the WordPress database. Someone's come along and done all of the hard work for you. So it handles the fact that custom post types or posts are spread across multiple tables, and it turns them into attributes on the model, on a proper model. It handles all of the relationships between users and posts and authors and all that type of stuff. It's done a lot of the hard work for you, but it still uses PDO because it's still running on Eloquent in the background, which is where I came across another solution. This is a nice little library which enables a MySQLi driver for Eloquent. The only problem is it was for Laravel 5.4, and I was using Lumen 8 at this stage when I started trying to implement this. Bit out of date, and as I investigated further, it wasn't just out of date, it was incomplete. So I forked it and I did the needful to make it work with Laravel 8 and Lumen 8. It's still not stable. It still is probably horribly insecure, but it works well enough for my purposes. So now what we do is we have a config file in Lumen, which is static. We don't need a .env because all of the environment stuff, all of the database stuff is already being set in WordPress, and it's available in WordPress as defined values. So we can just set up a connection using those defined values. Then I thought, you know what, we're still going to be opening to connections this way. So I modified that previous Eloquent library a little bit further so we could just straight up pass it the MySQLi connection that WordPress is already using. So now we have full access to the database using MySQLi without opening a second connection, and we can pull models out fairly easily. And we get to the next challenge, the final challenge I'm going to cover here, which is the loop. If you're not aware what the loop is in WordPress, it's this. It's if have posts, while have posts, the post. It's a pretty heinous piece of global state changing malarkey. So it relies on the state of a global variable called WP query. Have posts checks if WP query has, any records. And the post, that function advances WP query to the next record. Once that's been done, then the title and the content and the post ID and a whole bunch of other functions read directly from whatever record is selected from WP query. It's pretty bad because the post changes application state relatively silently. It's not good practice. You shouldn't do this anymore. If you're writing new software and you do have something which changes global application state halfway through a process with a function call, please don't do that again. Things will also break if you haven't called the post. So if you try to call the title or the content before you call the post, then it hasn't queued up anything in WP query. So those functions don't fail gracefully. They don't call the post and grab the next thing. They just freak out. Things break. And on the other side of that, if something else calls the post again, it will move the model forward without telling you. You won't know. I've seen this before on another client site, a weird bug where a template would start up and it would show the title of a post, and then it would call a shortcode which happened to call the post itself for reasons I will never understand. And then by the time it got to the showing the content of the WordPress post or the blog post, that shortcode had moved it on to the next post. So you would get alternating one post title, the next post content, and then the next post title, and then the next post content. So you wouldn't get the same title and content for any two posts. Pretty terrible. Terrible problems, they kind of need even worse solutions. So that's what I did here. I grabbed the list of post IDs from the loop. Can't avoid it. It's already there. WordPress already knows what it's looking for. Get the IDs. Once I have all of the IDs, I can just grab a collection of post models from Corcel. And I can hide the whole thing in a common class. So in this case, I hid it in the base controller class, which all of the other controllers subclass off. So the index controller, as an example, we can DD this collect posts, and we can see we've got a full collection of posts with all of the post data associated. If we use Blade, because we can have a look and we'll see we can use posts count. We can use for each post as post. And each time we know that that post is always going to be that post. It doesn't matter if some plugin calls the post in between. Our models are consistent and they won't change. And it works. We get the ability to just straight up output content from Corcel models. So it's probably about time to go over what we've learned. WordPress is incredibly flexible, partly by design and partly because it is a legacy project and it wasn't built particularly defensively. You can get away with a lot with WordPress and a lot of other legacy projects if you just know how to work around or work within their weird models of execution. Just because something's legacy doesn't mean you're trapped. And this may be a weird and stupid experiment with WordPress, but the same principles have been applied by me and other people to other projects in the past. Other legacy projects where you can inject Laravel or Lumen or some other modern technology in without having to worry too much about how the legacy works, because the legacy wasn't built with the idea of security or knowing how the whole application works. It's just kind of a soup of different includes. You probably shouldn't use this in production. This is ugly code. This is a mess. It was a an experiment. It worked, but it's an experiment and it should be treated as such. Really don't use this code in production unless you've already done it. So when I started writing up this talk and working on converting Lumen into a WordPress theme, I started reaching out to a few people thinking, haha, isn't this a funny idea? I bet it's weird and unique and such a terrible idea. No one will have ever done it. And I found multiple people who had quite seriously merged WordPress into Laravel and Laravel into WordPress. And they've done it a couple of ways. I've picked up clients more recently where WordPress is in the Laravel public directory, and then inside there is published theme parts from Laravel, which deep inside the WordPress directory. So it's a kind of one inside the other. I've seen other setups as well. Even using WordPress and using a tool like Cosel to just access the database. So WordPress is used for content editing, and then a completely separate Laravel application uses that content to show to wherever it needs to show it it basically is a display layer for WordPress. So if you want to use modern tools and you still have to use WordPress, there are a few alternatives. Sage is probably the original genesis of this idea. It's a project which exists to use Blade templates as WordPress for WordPress templates, and it has a couple of other things like Webpack and Mix and stuff like that in there too. So it's grabbed a couple of bits of Laravel standalone, pulled them out and shoved them into a WordPress theme. It's a good project, but it's not a complete it's not a complete framework. So there's kind of the concept of controllers, not really much in the way of routing. Its approach to template acquisition is it uses the filter hook to the filter for template acquisition to insert .blade into the files that WordPress is looking for. So it's not actually using proper routing or anything like that. Timber is another version that I've seen used to great effect in the past a few times, which is it actually has its own models. It has controllers and it has a bunch of the other framework bits. It's not built on any other framework. It's its own thing. So it doesn't look like Laravel or Symfony or any of the other frameworks that you might be used to seeing. It does a good job, but you have to understand that it's also built around the idea of what WordPress can and should typically do. And the other way to deal with new technology in WordPress is go headless. So I've seen a couple of people who use Gatsby.js and make a static site generator. And they feed the data automatically from the WordPress instance through GraphQL. So once again, the display layer is not actually attached to WordPress anymore. So now is a good time for questions if there are any. If you want to give me any feedback on this, if you can either give it to me in Swapcard or you can go to my site and shout abuse at me. The slides will be up there as well. And if for whatever reason you want to see and play with the code, it is up on GitHub at that address. I will warn you, it was bad. It's bad code. It was written for this and I pretty much haven't touched it otherwise. But you can clone it down, dump it into a WordPress folder, and run Composer. I've got Webpack running. I've got it set up with Tailwind, and it's pretty much ready to go. Alrighty. So let's see questions. Is WordPress planning to itself shifting towards PHP developer-friendly architecture? This is a good question. When I first gave this talk a year or so ago, it was at a WordCamp, and there were a number of people from Automatic who were kind of looking at it and going, how could we apply some of these principles to the WordPress code base? It's tough because the problem that WordPress has is they have to support a lot of legacy code, not just their own. If they change fundamentally the way WordPress works, then hundreds, millions of sites will break because themes won't update properly or won't get updated, plugins won't get updated. Basically, they will trash the utility of WordPress for existing code, which puts them in a hard spot. That being said, the internals of what WordPress does has changed quite significantly over the years. So it's using MySQLi now. There's a lot of objects that are being used in the background. They're just being hidden behind global state changing functions. So a lot of the changes have come, they're just not fully there yet. And to make it more modern from the ground up is going to be, at the very least, a major version change, and a lot of people who are angry at needing to change how they understand WordPress. Not sure if there's anything else. Yeah, I can see you've used Timber to work with Twig templates. I did forget about that. Timber does use Twig, so it has at least a standard template language that it uses. The rest of Timber isn't working with any standard framework that I'm aware of. I did have a bit of a dig through while I was working on this project just to understand it. And yeah, this entire experiment doesn't touch the WP core at all. You can download that code and throw it in the themes folder, and it works. Once again, you'll have to run Composer install to pull down the dependencies from Laravel, but none of this touches WP core at all. It just works straight up like any other theme, which is kind of the goal. I didn't want to have to modify WordPress at all to get this thing to happen. But I did modify Lumen reasonably heavily in a couple of other projects. So yeah, that was kind of surprising that I didn't need to modify the WP core at all for it to work.
All right, thank you so much for a great session, and thank you everyone for asking some real great questions. As long as we don't have any other questions, can we get some virtual applause in the chat? Just checking in the chat to make sure there are no more questions.
Thanks for listening, and I'm giving you another talk tomorrow a little bit earlier about my adventures in legacy code and upgrading it.
Okay, perfect. Hopefully we will see you all there. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you for giving a great talk, and have a great evening.
Yeah, will do. It is 1:30 a.m. here.
That's okay. Well, so go to bed.
I'm going to bed after this.
Okay. Good night.
Right, good night.
Bye.